It started like any other quiet Sunday in the town of Grantham, Maine, the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked and still sleep through the night. Walter Brennan had lived there all his life, a man of habits. Every morning without fail, he'd be on that same porch by 6, coffee in one hand, local paper in the other, just watching the stillness around him come alive. Birds chirping, wind moving through pine trees. One by one, the neighbors walking their dogs would lift a hand and get a slow, deliberate wave in return. That was just Walter. His daughter Marlene lived next door. She checked on him most mornings, usually not because she had to, but because she wanted to. He wasn't the kind of man to ask for help, even after his knees began giving him trouble, even after he started needing the cane he hated using. That morning, she looked out her kitchen window around 6:30 and saw him there, rocking gently in his chair, steaming mug of coffee resting on the table beside him. He seemed peaceful, unbothered, nothing out of the ordinary. By 9:15, the chair was empty. The mug sat untouched, now cold. The paper hadn't been flipped past the first page, and Walter's cane, the same one he needed to get down even the porch steps, still leaned against the inside wall of the door, exactly where he always left it. At first, Marlene figured he'd walked out back. He sometimes wandered through the small woods behind his property, looking for deer trails or checking on the fence. It was still a little strange that he'd leave without his cane, but maybe he thought he'd only be gone a minute. Maybe he got stubborn again, like he did sometimes. Still, by noon, when the sandwich she brought over sat untouched on the counter and his slippers hadn't moved an inch, a dull anxiety began to sink in. She knocked around the property first, called his name, checked the shed, the garage, even the barn with the rusted door that hadn't opened right since the 80s. Nothing. It was as if he'd just stood up and walked away, but the porch showed no sign of struggle or even movement, no fallen coffee, no drag marks, no footprints in the dewy grass, just stillness. By early afternoon, Marlene called her brother, then the sheriff. What started as a nervous check-in quickly escalated. Deputies arrived before sunset and did a sweep of the immediate area, but came up empty. Neighbors hadn't seen anything unusual. Nobody heard a car, a shout, or even a dog barking. Walter's truck still sat in the gravel driveway, keys inside. His wallet was on the kitchen counter, and his cell phone, an old flip phone he barely knew how to use, was still on its charger. The official report would later note the time of last confirmed sighting as approximately 6:30 a.m., the time Marlene saw him from the kitchen window. After that, Walter Brennan was gone. By dusk, floodlights had been brought in. Officers swept the wooded perimeter with flashlights while search volunteers moved in grid patterns through the nearby brush. A deputy asked about medical conditions, if there was any chance he was confused, disoriented. Marlene hesitated. She'd seen small signs lately, him forgetting names, repeating stories, but nothing drastic. He still paid his bills, still remembered her birthday. Still kept a notebook by his chair with phone numbers, medication reminders, even the date circled every Sunday for their weekly pancake breakfast. Still, they took it seriously. Older man, mild memory loss, alone, rural property. Every box for a missing persons alert quietly checked. They brought in bloodhounds just before midnight. The dog sniffed his slippers, his chair, the armrest he always touched. One of them picked up a scent and led searchers to the backwoods, but stopped just 50 yards in, circling confused. The trail ended suddenly, like it had been severed. The next morning, search teams were expanded. Local news picked it up. "Elderly man vanishes from own porch," the headline read. It didn't make sense. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that Walter left on his own, and yet no signs of struggle either. The ground was dry, the furniture undisturbed. Even the wind chimes still swayed peacefully on the beam above his rocker. By the end of day 2, the theory of a medical emergency, a fall maybe, was starting to seem unlikely. If he had collapsed somewhere nearby, they'd have found him. The woods around his house weren't dense enough to hide someone for long, not with a search team of that size. And yet, there was nothing. No fabric caught on branches, no dropped item, no voice responding to their calls. The absence of answers quickly became its own kind of noise. That night, Marlene sat in her father's chair. She held his mug in both hands, still stained faintly by old coffee rings. A notebook sat on the table beside her. The last entry was dated 2 days before. Saw fox near shed. Fence needs fixing. Forgot what I was looking for. She read it over and over again. Then she looked up. The woodshed was still locked, the cane still untouched, and the porch, once the safest place Walter knew, suddenly felt colder than the woods. By Monday morning, Walter Brennan's disappearance had gone from local concern to something far stranger. Deputies from the Androscoggin County Sheriff's Office returned just after sunrise with reinforcements. They brought fresh eyes, more hounds, and a mobile command unit parked in front of Marlene's house. The family had hoped maybe he'd wandered off and was holed up somewhere, cold and embarrassed, waiting for someone to find him. But that hope began thinning out as fast as the frost melting off the morning grass. The first thing the new team did was recheck the property, meticulously. They started at the porch. The sheriff himself crouched low and studied the wooden steps, the flower beds beneath the railing, and the dirt path that led to the back lot. It had rained lightly the day before, just a drizzle, enough to dampen the ground, enough that any footstep should have left an impression. But nothing had. Not a single heel mark, boot print, or scuff. No signs of anyone leaving. No signs of anyone arriving. The coffee mug from the morning he disappeared still sat on the porch rail. It had gone untouched, now washed by the morning dew. The paper had curled slightly in the sun, wind flipping pages softly. Walter's chair, a white rocker with chipped arms and a green cushion, remained perfectly positioned, facing the woods, gently creaking when the wind caught it just right. Deputies expanded the search perimeter by another 500 yards in all directions. Dogs were rotated and rescented, starting again with items from inside the house. This time they were given Walter's flannel jacket and a pillowcase from his bedroom. The bloodhounds picked up on something faint, made it just past the edge of the yard, then again stopped, confused, disoriented. One sat down and began whining. It didn't make sense. The terrain was soft enough to track, yet undisturbed. There were no broken branches, no torn bits of clothing snagged on fences, no pushed over bushes, just stillness. It was as if Walter hadn't walked away, but had been lifted up and removed entirely. The sheriff made a comment that morning that would repeat in the local news for weeks. Standing by the porch, arms crossed, he muttered to his deputy, "It's like the man just evaporated." By mid-morning, neighbors began showing up with their own gear. Some brought flashlights, others ropes and walking sticks, backpacks with bottled water and protein bars. Everyone wanted to help. Walter was one of their own, a man who lent tools without asking for them back, who used to mow his neighbor's lawn just because he liked the noise. People fanned out into the woods in volunteer teams, each assigned a quadrant, each told to call out his name every few minutes and to look carefully, not just for a body but for anything, a lost shoe, a pocket knife, a crushed bit of earth. But the woods gave nothing back. Marlene stayed behind with her brother David. They combed through the house for clues, receipts, lists, notes, anything that might hint at where Walter had planned to go. Nothing was out of place. His wallet, still full of cash, was untouched on the hallway table. His keys were hanging on their usual hook. The refrigerator was stocked. His watch was still on the bathroom counter next to the toothpaste. Even the old AM radio in the kitchen was tuned to his favorite station, the dial untouched. It looked like a man who had paused his morning and simply never resumed it. David stepped outside around noon and stared hard at the gravel driveway. Something was bothering him. He remembered that when he'd first arrived the previous morning, the gravel had looked smooth, like no tires had moved across it in days. He checked again. Still no new tracks, no strange treads, no sign that a car or truck had pulled up quietly to the house to take Walter somewhere. If someone had come for him, they didn't drive. That afternoon, the department brought in a drone. It hovered low over the tree canopy, scanning for color or movement. From above, the woods looked peaceful, even beautiful. But to the family watching the monitor, it was suffocating, endless pines stretching too far in every direction, and none of them offering any trace of the man they were trying to find. By nightfall, deputies had knocked on every door within a 2-mile radius. No one had seen anything. One man thought he might have heard something early that morning, what he described as a strange thump, but he wasn't sure if it was even real or just a dream he'd had. Another neighbor mentioned hearing Walter's wind chimes that morning, just before sunrise, but assumed it was just the breeze. No vehicles had been reported in or out of the area that didn't belong. No hikers had passed through, no deliveries, no workers scheduled. It was a Sunday morning in a quiet town. Everyone had been home. That night, Marlene sat in her father's recliner, the one in the living room just across from the television. She hadn't cried yet, not really. There was still a part of her holding on to the idea that this was just some bizarre accident, that Walter would come walking out of the woods, sheepish and confused, maybe explaining something they hadn't thought of, a detour, a blackout, a medical episode, something. But she kept looking through the window toward the porch, and every time she did, all she saw was that empty chair, slowly rocking in the dark. By the third day, with no sign of Walter Brennan and no physical evidence pointing to where he might have gone, the focus quietly began to shift. If he hadn't simply wandered off, and if no accident had occurred within the immediate area, then someone had to start asking, who was Walter really? And was there anything at all in his history that could explain what happened? On paper, he was the last person anyone would expect to vanish. 78 years old, retired Navy mechanic, widower for 11 years. He lived modestly in the home he'd shared with his wife, Ellen, since the early 70s. It was a white single-story with a tin roof and moss creeping up the back shingles. After Ellen passed, Walter stayed put, didn't travel, didn't remarry. His days followed a pattern: morning coffee on the porch, breakfast, a walk around the yard, afternoon crossword at the diner if he was feeling social, and back home before dusk. The sheriff's team started pulling together a timeline of Walter's last week. Groceries had been purchased on Tuesday. A vet appointment for his old dog Harlow had been canceled Thursday. Walter left a voicemail saying he wasn't feeling up for it. That was the only anomaly. His prescriptions, all routine for blood pressure and cholesterol, were refilled a month ago. Nothing in the trash or his medicine cabinet suggested missed doses or sudden changes. Neighbors described him the same way: kind, quiet, stubborn. The kind of man who still chopped his own wood even when his hands shook doing it. He didn't ask for help, didn't offer much opinion, but always nodded and smiled when spoken to. His house was orderly, his lawn trimmed. No flags, no bumper stickers. He belonged to the American Legion Post but hadn't attended in months. Then came the first ripple. A deputy interviewing folks up and down the road heard from a woman named Carol Fielding, neighbor 2 houses down. She recalled a loud argument between Walter and the man who lived directly next door, a local contractor named Curtis Langley. According to her, it happened about 6 months earlier. Something to do with property lines. Walter thought Curtis's new shed extended a few feet onto his land. She didn't hear much, just raised voices, and the word survey repeated more than once. No violence, no police call. But the memory came back strong, mostly because she remembered it being so out of character. The team followed up with Curtis. He answered questions politely, seemed shaken by Walter's disappearance, said the argument had been minor, resolved after a new boundary marker was placed. He was particular about his yard, Curtis admitted. Didn't like things changing. But we were fine after that. Still, deputies noted that Curtis's backyard, the one with the shed in question, backed up directly to the same woods Walter's porch faced, close enough that a flashlight could have illuminated it from either side. When asked if he'd noticed anything unusual the morning Walter vanished, Curtis shook his head. "I was out early. Left before 6 for a job up in Farmington. Didn't even look over that way." He offered to let them search his property. Nothing was found. Next came the issue of Walter's memory. Marlene, when pressed gently, admitted her father had been slipping a little. Nothing dramatic, no wandering episodes, no calls from confused strangers. But he'd started repeating stories, forgetting appointments, misplacing tools. Just a few weeks ago, he had accused her of moving the salt when it was in the same spot it always was. She'd chalked it up to age. David, her brother, shared a story about finding Walter sitting on the porch one night around 11 p.m., fully dressed with his keys in hand. When asked what he was doing, Walter had simply said he was waiting for Ellen to come out. It had rattled David more than he let on at the time, but he hadn't brought it up again. No diagnosis had ever been made. Walter refused to see a neurologist, said forgetfulness was part of aging, nothing more. But now, every lapse began to look like a clue in hindsight. The sheriff added the possibility of cognitive decline to the case notes. If Walter had wandered off in a moment of confusion, it could explain the absence of preparation: no cane, no keys, no proper shoes. But it didn't explain the absence of footprints, or why the dogs kept losing the scent so close to home. And then there was the oddity of his notes. Inside the small notebook by his rocker, between grocery lists and neighbor phone numbers, were a few entries that didn't quite sit right. One read, "Man at the tree line again, wearing the orange cap, just watching." Another said, "Heard tapping on the shed door last night. Nothing there when I looked." Marlene had never seen those entries before. She tried to laugh them off at first, paranoia maybe, or an old man with a fading sense of time. But when the sheriff read them, he didn't laugh. He marked the page with a tab. If Walter had been confused, was it confusion? Or had he seen something no one else did? If he had enemies, was it an old argument? Or something he never had the chance to name? And if he left of his own accord, why was there no sign that he ever moved at all? The questions deepened. The ground around the porch remained still, and the notebook, left open on the table, kept that single line in shaky pencil. Just watching. By Thursday morning, 4 days after Walter Brennan disappeared, investigators were already running out of places to search. The woods behind his house had been scoured multiple times, each pass yielding the same result: nothing. No blood, no clothing, no broken branches. It was like chasing a shadow. But that's when one neighbor brought something forward no one had thought to ask for yet. Kyle Hastings lived 2 properties over. He was an avid hunter and had trail cameras mounted along the tree line that separated his land from Walter's. Most of the time they picked up deer, coyotes, the occasional fox. He hadn't checked the footage since last week, figuring nothing worth seeing had happened. But when his wife mentioned it, something clicked. If Walter had walked into the woods, especially before dawn, maybe the trail cam saw him. Kyle brought the SD card straight to the command post. Officers loaded it onto a laptop. The files were sorted by time, labeled automatically by the camera's motion sensor. On Sunday, the morning Walter vanished, the first clip began just after 5:45 a.m., a raccoon moving near a bush. The second, at 6:03 a.m., was different. The frame opened on the usual patch of pine and underbrush. Nothing at first. Then, near the edge, something moved. A figure, blurred and partially obscured by branches, crossed from left to right. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't meandering either. A purposeful walk. The silhouette was thin, upright, human, not quite identifiable, but clearly someone. The timestamp burned into the bottom corner, 6:03:17 a.m. That was almost exactly 30 minutes after Marlene had seen Walter sitting on the porch with his coffee. The strange part wasn't just that the figure was there. It was the direction. The person wasn't heading toward the road or the trail that led to the next property. They were moving back, deeper into the woods, toward the area no one had paid much attention to. It led to the old woodshed. Walter hadn't used it in over 20 years. It was barely visible now, tucked behind a thicket of pine and scrub maple. The structure had warped with time, the roof sagging under fallen needles and years of frost, but it was still standing. A relic from when Walter kept chickens and tools farther from the main house. Officers hiked back to it, this time not as a courtesy but as a focal point. What they found stopped them cold. The woodshed's door was secured by a thick metal padlock, newer than the rest of the shed, shiny, recently oiled, no rust, no corrosion, but the latch was installed on the inside of the door. They called it in. Deputies forced the lock using bolt cutters. The air that escaped when they pried the door open was stale and cold, not fresh like the surrounding woods. Inside, it was dark. Only a single narrow window let in light, and even that was mostly blocked by overgrowth. The floor was covered in dirt, old hay, and broken tools, an overturned wheelbarrow, rotted tarp. But there was no sign of Walter. What struck them immediately, though, was the absence of dust on one side of the room. Footprints. Human. Barely visible, but there. Someone had been inside recently. There were scuffs on the floorboards, just under the beam that once held a pulley hook. Officers took photographs, marked the boot size, roughly a men's 11, and stepped carefully around the edges. They found a thermos buried under the tarp, cracked, faded green, but dry inside. A cigarette butt near the window, filter-only brand. Walter didn't smoke. And then, tucked behind a stack of old paint cans, they found something strange. A pile of pine needles, fresh ones, green, still slightly damp. But the trees above the shed didn't match. There were no pine trees tall enough to shed that kind of debris directly onto the shed, meaning they'd been brought in. Someone had been inside the shed, recently. Someone who either entered through the woods or was already there before the lock appeared. The forensic team swabbed every surface, the thermos, the cigarette, the lock, but everything came back clean, wiped or worn smooth. By that evening, the shed had become a new focal point in the investigation. But if Walter had been taken there or wandered there in confusion, why was the lock sealed from the inside? How could someone leave without unlocking the door? And more importantly, who had the key? They questioned Kyle again, asked if he recognized the figure on the camera. He shook his head. "It's too blurry," he said, "too fast." When asked if anyone else might have had access to the shed, Kyle hesitated, then shrugged. "No one's used it in years. I didn't even know it was still standing." That night, the sheriff issued a quiet order. Every property within a half-mile would be checked, every outbuilding, root cellar, or crawl space, and the trail cam footage, that was sent to the state lab for enhancement. But the last few frames, no matter how much they were cleaned up, all showed the same thing. A shadow in the trees, moving toward the shed, then disappearing entirely. It was a full 8 days since Walter Brennan had vanished when the case took its first hard turn. Up until then, everything had been theory, conjecture, shadows in trail cam footage, footprints in forgotten corners, whispers about memory loss and old disputes. But what happened on that Tuesday morning brought something physical back into the investigation, something personal, and something disturbingly out of place. It started with a dog. Neighbors Jim and Luann Penbrook lived about 3/4 of a mile down from Walter's property, close to the bend where the woods opened into a shallow creek. They owned a shepherd mix named Rosie, 10 years old, mostly calm, the kind of dog who stuck to known paths and never wandered far. But that morning, just after sunrise, Rosie bolted out from the back porch and didn't come when called. She returned 40 minutes later, panting and wide-eyed, carrying something in her teeth. At first, Luann thought it was a scrap of old blanket or a torn towel, but when she took it from the dog's mouth, her hands froze. The fabric was flannel, gray and red, faded with age, ripped unevenly down the middle. There were buttons on one side, one missing. And the pattern. It matched the shirt Walter Brennan had been wearing the morning he disappeared. Marlene had described it in detail. She'd even shown deputies a photo of him in it from 2 Christmases ago. Within the hour, deputies were at the Penbrook property, retracing Rosie's path into the woods. The dog, now leashed, was hesitant to go back, tail low, ears twitching. But after some coaxing, she led them east, through the thicker pines, past a thicket no one had marked before, and down a slight slope toward the creek. That area had already been searched. On the second day of the disappearance, volunteers had walked the perimeter. Bloodhounds had sniffed through it. The terrain was open and quiet, the kind of place a man might go to sit and think. But nothing had turned up, no scent, no sign. Until now. Roughly 20 yards from the waterline, beneath a young sapling, one of the deputies noticed disturbed soil. A patch the size of a dinner plate, freshly turned. When they cleared away the top layer of pine needles and roots, they found it, something glinting faintly in the light. Walter's wedding band. It was scratched and dulled, but unmistakable. Marlene confirmed it herself. His initials were engraved inside, a WJB, followed by the date he and Ellen married, 6/12/1965. He'd worn it every day since she passed, never took it off, not even to shower. Now it was half buried in the woods. The implications set in slowly. The shirt scrap and the ring were only feet apart, both freshly exposed, both located in an area that had already been combed, meaning either the initial search missed them, which seemed unlikely, given how thoroughly that region had been swept, or someone had returned to that area recently. Someone who placed or dropped those items after the first wave of search efforts had ended. The soil sample around the ring was bagged and sent for lab testing, but initial analysis showed no blood, no sign of decomposition, just dirt, roots, and moisture. The flannel had no trace of skin or tissue, but had a faint chemical scent, some kind of industrial oil or cleaning solution. Forensics couldn't pinpoint it immediately. Theories began to splinter again. If Walter had walked there on his own, confused or distressed, how did he lose only a piece of his shirt and his ring? And how did he bury it? If it wasn't him, then someone had been moving through the woods undetected, someone who wanted these items to be found, or perhaps to appear as though they were found naturally. The investigators didn't say it out loud, not yet. But the logic was turning dark. Staging, a breadcrumb trail, a signal. When asked again about Rosie's behavior, Jim mentioned something strange. The dog had come back from the woods with her fur damp, not soaked, but wet enough to suggest she'd been near the creek, and there was dirt on her front paws, as if she'd been digging. One of the deputies followed that hunch and returned to the site later that afternoon. 10 feet from the sapling, under the shadow of a fallen birch, he found another patch of disturbed earth, this one deeper. He marked it, but didn't excavate immediately. They needed to bring in the forensic team. Before sunset, the area had been sealed off. No body was found that day. But the discovery shifted everything. Walter hadn't simply vanished into the woods. Someone had been back. Someone had something to place. Or something to hide. And the creek, calm, shallow, slow-moving, had become more than a boundary line between properties. It was now part of the story. A place someone had returned to. A place where dogs dug up things meant to stay buried. By the 9th day, the story of Walter Brennan's disappearance had begun to settle into that quiet, uneasy place where cases go when no one knows what to do next. The search parties had thinned. The sheriff's department had moved its command center back to town. Reporters stopped calling. For the Brennan family, it was like watching someone slowly lower the volume on a scream that never stopped ringing in their ears. Then, on a chilly Friday evening, something happened that stirred everything up again. At around 6:30 p.m., a local teenager named Noah Vickers showed up unannounced at the sheriff's substation. He looked nervous, hands stuffed into the sleeves of a hoodie, glancing around like he wasn't sure if he should even be there. He asked to speak with someone about the old guy who went missing. A deputy on duty, Officer Gleason, took him to a side room and asked him to explain. Noah swore he'd seen Walter, not recently but the morning after he disappeared, Monday, just before school. Around 7 a.m., he'd been walking past the old Carter place, an abandoned farmhouse just off Old Maple Lane, barely 2 properties down from Walter's. The house had been empty for years, boarded up, overgrown, left to sink into its own rot. Nobody went near it. But that morning, Noah said he happened to glance up at the second-story window, the small one tucked just beneath the roof peak, the attic, and he saw a man standing there, pale face. Thinning white hair, wearing what looked like a red and gray flannel shirt. The man didn't move, didn't wave, just stared. Noah didn't recognize Walter by name, but when he saw his photo on a flyer later that week, same shirt, same face, he felt sick. He hadn't told anyone right away because he thought no one would believe him, but after hearing his parents talk about the wedding ring found in the woods, he couldn't keep quiet anymore. At first, the report was treated with caution. It had been almost a full week since Noah claimed to see Walter. The idea of a man that age climbing into an attic, without his cane, without help, didn't make much sense, but Officer Gleason drove out anyway. The Carter house was just a few minutes away, and no lead, at that point, could be dismissed. The place looked like every other forgotten house in rural Maine, peeling paint, collapsed porch steps, one shutter dangling by a nail. Gleason had to push open the warped front door with his shoulder. The smell hit immediately. Mildew, dead insulation, rodent droppings. The downstairs was undisturbed. Layers of dust coated the floor, except for the paths where mice had run. A few broken bottles in the sink, old newspapers from 2007. But the staircase to the second floor was intact, and Gleason climbed it slowly. The second level had 2 bedrooms and a hallway leading to a narrow pull-down ladder, the kind that unfolded with a screeching groan. At the top, he aimed his flashlight into the attic space. Dust hung like fog. He climbed. The attic was small, just a crawl space, really. Plywood floor, slanted ceiling, one tiny window set into the front wall, the same one Noah had pointed out. There was nothing up there, no bedding, no discarded clothing. But on the floor, in the dust near the window, Gleason saw something that made him pause. A single footprint, full, clear, left shoe. The tread was crisp, undisturbed. It looked fresh, no more than a few days old. He marked it, took photos, and later had it measured. Men's size 11. Walter Brennan wore a size 9. There was no other evidence, no fingerprints on the window, no signs of a struggle. But someone had stood in that attic, looking out. And it hadn't been decades ago, it had been recent. And whoever it was had walked in without disturbing anything else. The lead triggered a full search of the Carter property. K9 units were brought in again, this time focused solely on scent near the attic ladder and the back exit. One of the dogs alerted at the base of the staircase, then again by the rear wall of the house. That's where investigators found something odd, a small latch near the floorboard concealed by an old strip of carpet. When pulled, it opened into a crawl space under the house, just large enough for someone to move through or hide. Inside were 3 items: an empty water bottle, a worn pair of leather gloves, and an orange hunting cap. The gloves were damp. The cap smelled faintly of motor oil. Forensics collected everything. Partial fingerprints were found on the bottle, too smudged to run. No DNA from Walter was recovered, but the cap. The cap matched something Marlene had mentioned weeks ago, reading from one of Walter's notebook entries. Man at the tree line again. Wearing the orange cap, just watching. Now, that cap was under the floorboards of an abandoned house a few hundred yards from Walter's back door. The footprint didn't belong to him. So if Walter wasn't the one in the attic window, who had Noah seen? Was it someone else, watching the house, pretending to be him? Or was it possible Walter had been there, only not alone? That night, floodlights lit up the Carter property, but the attic stayed quiet. And whoever left that footprint never came back. By day 11, most people had stopped expecting any kind of resolution. Even the Brennan family, still holding on to some fragile thread of hope, had begun speaking of Walter in the past tense without realizing it. Meals sat half-eaten. The porch remained untouched. The only sound at the house most days was the wind hitting the empty rocking chair. But then, on a quiet Wednesday morning, a call came in that would bring everyone back to Walter's property, and not just the family, but the entire investigation. Curtis Langley, the neighbor with the shed dispute months back, was walking the fence line with a contractor. They were checking damage from a recent storm when he noticed something strange. The woodshed, Walter's old one, half swallowed by trees and decay, looked different. He couldn't say exactly what was off at first. Maybe the way the door hung, maybe the lack of glare from the padlock he'd seen clearly last week when police pried it open, inspected it, and locked it back shut. Now the padlock was gone. Curtis didn't go inside. He didn't even touch the door. Just called the sheriff's office again and said, "You need to see this. Someone's been back there." Deputies arrived within the hour, this time with forensic backup and clear protocol. The perimeter was taped off. Photographs were taken before the door was touched. It swung open easily, unlocked, no resistance. Inside, the stale smell had changed. There was a dampness now, like the space had been lived in, and there were new items inside. A thermal blanket lay crumpled on the floor, dust only half settled on it. A cracked thermos rested near one wall, its lid missing. And in the far corner, under the crooked window frame, sat an old camping cot. The legs were rusted, but the mattress was intact. On top was a stained pillow. On that pillow, strands of hair. The team bagged everything: swabs, fibers, samples from the blanket, the cot, the floorboards beneath the thermos. Soil outside the shed was freshly compressed, as if someone had stood there repeatedly over the past few days. The window had been wiped in a circular pattern, like someone clearing fog with their hand to look out. Then came the sound. In the corner of the shed, half buried under old burlap sacks, a portable radio crackled to life. The volume was low, barely audible, just static, No station, no music, just the soft, endless hum of emptiness. No one could say how long it had been on. The batteries were halfway corroded, but somehow it worked. Someone had turned it on recently. Someone had sat there, listening to nothing. Back at the lab, the hair from the pillow was tested. It was Walter's. There was no blood, no skin tissue, no sign of injury. But it was conclusive. He'd been in that shed. Whether willingly or not, he'd laid down on that cot, maybe to sleep, maybe to wait. The implications were devastating. Walter hadn't just disappeared from his porch and vanished into the trees. He'd been alive, afterward. He'd been here, at least once, maybe more, while people searched, while his family stood just yards away, while the woods around him echoed with dogs and voices calling his name. He had been in that rotting shed, tucked behind a screen of overgrowth and silence. The theory changed overnight. If Walter had been confused, wandering in the fog of memory loss, he somehow still managed to unlock and relock a door with a latch installed from the inside. If someone had taken him there, the question became, why let him go? Or worse, why return to set the scene again? The radio brought up new questions too. Walter hadn't used it in years, but in the 1980s, he'd kept that very model, a weather-resistant General Electric AM/FM, tuned constantly to the maritime forecast, old habit from his Navy days. His family recognized it instantly when shown photos. David even remembered seeing it in the garage a few years ago, dusty but still intact. But no one could explain how it ended up in the shed. It hadn't been there during the first sweep. Deputies were sure of it. They'd documented every item back then. The cot, the blanket, the radio, all new additions. Meaning someone came back, not to take Walter, but to mark the place with him. It was staging, but in reverse. Not an effort to conceal a crime, but to leave behind a presence. A trace. A message that said, he was here. No fingerprints were found on the cot or thermos. The radio had one partial print, too degraded to run. But the psychological toll was immediate. Marlene couldn't bring herself to walk down to the shed. She stood at the edge of the yard while deputies worked, arms folded tightly, eyes locked on the trees. She whispered to David, I was out here. I sat right there on the porch, the night they searched. He could have been in that shed the whole time. David didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. Only the wind, and the soft, pulsing hiss of static bleeding into the quiet. The discovery at the woodshed should have brought clarity. Instead, it deepened the sense that something far more orchestrated was happening, something that wasn't just about a man disappearing, but about someone making it look like he had. 2 days after the shed was found, reopened, investigators received a tip from a sanitation worker in the next town over, Cresswell, about 18 miles east of Grantham. The man had seen the news about Walter Brennan's disappearance and remembered something odd from just before it all began. On the Friday morning before Walter vanished, a man had come to the municipal dump unusually early, before the gates were officially open. Security cameras had picked him up tossing a heavy rolled tarp and a bundle of yellow rope into one of the construction debris bins. He didn't stick around, didn't speak to anyone, just drove in, dumped his items quickly, and left. It struck the worker as strange, not illegal, just rushed. But after seeing Walter's case all over the local news, he figured it might matter. The dump supervisor pulled the footage from that morning. It was time-stamped at 6:14 a.m., less than 48 hours before Walter was last seen on his porch. The video was grainy, black and white, fixed from a high corner pole. The man appeared to be of average height, wearing a bulky jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. His face was angled down. What caught attention most was the footwear, work boots, thick-soled, dark-colored, with an exaggerated tread pattern that left clear impressions in the soft dirt. The same kind of pattern found in the attic of the abandoned Carter house, size 11, same as the print near the shed. Investigators zoomed in, frame by frame, no identifying logos. The truck he drove, an early 2000s silver GMC Sierra, had mud caked along the doors and a dent in the rear fender, but the license plate was either removed or deliberately obscured. They pulled stills and ran facial recognition. Nothing came back. No hits in any local, state, or national database. No registered vehicles matching the visible portions of the truck's bodywork. No missing person reports that matched the man's build. When they retrieved the tarp and rope from the dump, both were too contaminated to trace directly to Walter's property. But a few things stood out. The rope had been clean cut, measured, not torn, and one end was wrapped in what appeared to be a section of duct tape with a faint smear of what might have been oil. Forensics couldn't pull usable prints from either item. The tarp itself was faded blue, common enough, but it had 3 irregular grommet holes punched along the edge, suggesting it had been modified or used repeatedly. When tested under alternate light, several faint stains were found, one of which returned a presumptive positive for blood. The sample was too degraded to match to Walter, but enough to list the item as potential biological evidence in the case file. At the station, the sheriff reviewed the footage 3 times in silence. The man's movements were methodical, nothing panicked or haphazard. He knew the angles of the cameras. He kept his face shielded the entire time. Premeditated. That was the word that surfaced again and again. If this man had something to do with Walter's disappearance, he'd been planning it, watching, preparing. They canvassed the dump's surrounding businesses, asked if anyone remembered a truck like the one on tape. No one did. A few recalled hearing an engine early that morning, but assumed it was normal traffic. Nothing was stolen, nothing was reported. When Marlene was shown the footage privately, she couldn't identify the man, but something in the posture struck her, the way he moved quickly but without rushing. Like someone on a schedule, she said, like he knew how long he could be there. The question no one could answer was why someone would dump a tarp and rope 2 days before Walter vanished, unless the disappearance had already started before Walter was even gone. Unless this person had already been in the area, already been watching him, already chosen him. One detective floated a theory that began to circulate internally, staging. Someone wasn't just hiding Walter. They were deliberately scattering pieces, moving objects, altering scenes, planting just enough to confuse the timeline, to make the case unsolvable by nature of contradiction. A ring buried after an area was searched, a shirt scrap found by a dog. A radio suddenly switched on, a footprint in a sealed attic. Now, a stranger discarding rope and tarp before the event even occurred. It was less a disappearance now, and more a performance. A sequence of deliberate mocking steps carefully placed. The only thing that hadn't appeared yet was Walter himself. Investigators began cross-referencing every gas station, rest stop, and highway camera in a 25-mile radius for that same truck. They came up empty. It was as if the man had entered the area for a single purpose, and then vanished, just like the person he might have taken. But unlike Walter, this man had left something behind. Not a body, just questions. By the 12th day, even the strangest developments were starting to lose their shock. A man goes missing without a trace. A locked shed turns up with a cot and a radio whispering static. A teenager sees a face in an attic window, and a stranger, caught on camera, discards rope and tarp before the disappearance even happens. Each detail seemed to collide with the next, muddying the line between what was real and what was being shown. But what Curtis Langley said that Friday morning pulled everything into sharper, colder focus. He showed up to the sheriff's office unannounced, pale, sleepless, hands trembling as he cradled a paper cup of coffee he barely touched. When they brought him into the back room, he didn't wait to be asked anything. He just sat down and said, "I should have told you this sooner. I didn't know it would matter." Curtis lived directly next to Walter. Their properties were divided by a row of thinning trees and a collapsed barbed wire fence that hadn't stood upright in years. They hadn't always gotten along. There'd been that property line dispute the year prior about where Curtis could build his new tool shed. It blew over quickly, but it left a quiet tension between the two homes. Not a feud, just a silence. But about 3 weeks before Walter vanished, Curtis had gone looking for an old ladder he'd loaned Walter the summer before. It was a tall aluminum one, hard to replace, and he remembered Walter had tucked it behind the woodshed. Only Curtis hadn't told anyone he was going to retrieve it. He hadn't knocked, he hadn't asked. He'd just walked back there alone on a Saturday afternoon when he knew Walter would be inside napping. The ladder wasn't behind the shed like he remembered. Figuring it might have been pulled inside, Curtis had tried the door. To his surprise, it wasn't locked. What he found inside made him stop cold. He didn't see Walter. No blanket, no cot, no radio. But on the far wall, where the light from the narrow window barely reached, something had been pinned up, carefully, deliberately. Old Polaroids, at least a dozen, thumbtacked in an uneven row across the rotting wood. Most were blurry, grainy shots of people Curtis didn't recognize: a woman walking along the highway shoulder, a man seated alone on a park bench, a boy standing at the edge of a soccer field. Each was taken from a distance, but close enough that you could see the expressions. Not posed, not smiling, just caught. But one photo was unmistakable. Walter, asleep on his porch, the newspaper falling from his hand. Taken from less than 2 feet away. From the left side, where the steps met the railing. The angle was tight, deliberate. Curtis said he stared at it for a full minute before backing out of the shed and shutting the door behind him. He didn't say anything to Walter, didn't take the ladder, didn't call the police. At the time, he told himself it was probably nothing, that maybe Walter had been taking strange photos, maybe part of some forgotten hobby. Maybe it was innocent, just weird. Or maybe someone else had broken in and left them there. But there'd been no sign of a break-in, no sign of struggle. Curtis had buried the memory. Until now. The deputies listening to his statement didn't speak for several seconds. When they asked why he hadn't come forward sooner, Curtis said what many people say when they don't want to admit they were afraid. I didn't think it meant anything. I wasn't sure what I saw. But the panic on his face now told another story. Officers returned to the shed within the hour, but the photos were gone. The wall was bare, no pins, no holes, no film edges curled under splinters, just the imprint of sunlight and dust patterns showing where something had once been. Someone had removed them. Whether before Walter vanished or after was impossible to say, but it raised new questions. If Walter hadn't taken those photos himself, and no one in the family believed he had, then who did? And why keep them hidden in the shed behind his home? Curtis's confession was entered into the official case log, and his property was searched. No photos, no ladder. Nothing linking him directly to the disappearance. But his story cracked open a chilling new layer. Walter hadn't just vanished under mysterious circumstances. Someone had been watching him, documenting him, getting close enough to take a photograph while he slept. And if that person had been in the woodshed weeks before Walter disappeared, it meant the planning had started long before anyone realized. Not random, not spontaneous, deliberate, targeted. That evening, Marlene sat on the porch, holding her father's coffee mug in her lap, listening to the wind move through the pine needles. Across the yard, past the tree line, the shed stood hidden in the shadows again. She kept thinking about the photo, the way someone would have had to crouch near the steps, barely inches from Walter's resting hand, to get that shot. And how whoever had done that had probably been back, maybe more than once, maybe even watching now. It was a still Sunday morning when they returned to the shed, 2 full weeks since Walter Brennan vanished from his porch. The morning air was brittle, quiet. No wind, no distant traffic, just the sound of footfalls crunching over pine needles and soft mud. There was no new tip, no late-night confession, just a decision by the lead investigator to go back one more time, to look at the shed again, not the floor, not the cot, not the footprints, but the structure. The team had been reviewing old inspection records, tracing when the shed was first built, when it had last been updated. Something didn't add up. The exterior dimensions listed on the property survey didn't match the interior measurements, by almost 16 inches. At first, that didn't seem unusual. Warped wood, collapsing frame. Time did strange things to buildings like that, but when an officer rapped on the back wall with a flashlight, the sound changed, hollow. Not like rot, like a space was waiting behind it. They began removing panels, one at a time, methodically, until they reached the far end where the cot had once been positioned, beneath the small window smeared with fingerprints. There, the boards gave way more easily. The wood felt newer, less brittle. Behind it, packed tightly with layers of insulation and drywall that didn't belong, was a vertical cavity, narrow, like a crawlspace upright. Then came the smell. It rolled out slowly at first, then thicker as the air shifted, a smell that made the deputy at the door gag, backpedaling before he even saw what was inside. Another officer stepped forward, then another. Flashlights were lowered, adjusted. In that vertical cavity, curled in on himself, was the body of Walter Brennan, partially decomposed, his knees pulled tight to his chest, his head bowed forward, his clothes, flannel shirt, corduroy pants, wool socks, still intact but weather-worn, his face sunken and pale. One hand rested on his stomach, the other pressed gently against the wall, palm open. The space was too tight to have walked into willingly, too tight to survive in for long. Forensics confirmed it was him within the hour. Dental records, hair samples, DNA from the pillow on the cot. The autopsy was fast-tracked by the state medical examiner. The cause of death was clear: dehydration compounded by hypothermia. No blunt force trauma, no signs of restraint or struggle. He had died within a matter of days, alone, in darkness, and yet the mystery only deepened. There was no clear mechanism for how Walter got into that cavity. No external latch, no internal brace, no airflow, no food, no water. Just a small pile of fabric scraps beneath his feet, possibly torn from the same blanket found earlier. And tucked into the wall beside his body, wedged into the insulation, were 4 Polaroid photographs. All of Walter. All taken at night. In one, he was sitting on his porch, slumped slightly as if dozing. In another, he appeared to be standing in his kitchen, staring out the window. The third was a blurry image of him walking down the hallway toward his back door. The fourth, perhaps the most chilling, was taken from inside the woodshed itself. He was sitting on the cot, looking directly at the camera. No photographs of other people, just him. The same man who had lived quietly, gone to bed early, waved politely to passing neighbors, captured again and again in moments he never knew were being watched. The questions surged immediately. Had Walter climbed into that wall space himself? Was he chased? Locked in? Had someone known he was there and left him? Or worse, had someone put him there and sealed the wall afterward? There were no fingerprints on the boards, no tool marks, no blood, no signs of a forced entry or exit. The timeline complicated things further. The condition of Walter's body suggested he had died within 4 or 5 days of his disappearance, meaning he'd likely still been alive when search crews passed just feet from the shed, when his family stood outside calling his name, when the dogs circled, confused, when the radio whispered static from the shadows. The manhunt shifted into something else. Not a rescue, not even a recovery, a reckoning. The last person to have mentioned entering the shed before Walter vanished, Curtis Langley, was questioned again, harder this time. But no charges were brought. His story didn't change, and though suspicion clung to him, the evidence wasn't there. His house was searched again. Nothing new surfaced. 2 weeks later, Curtis moved out of Grantham, sold the house to a couple from Boston, left town without telling anyone. No goodbye, no forwarding address. The official report closed the case under accidental death due to environmental exposure. The coroner listed it as tragic but unintentional. No foul play, no proof otherwise. But in town, no one called it that. They called it wrong. Off, unfinished. Because a man doesn't die like that, trapped in his own shed, with photographs no one claims, in a space no one built, not by accident. The woodshed was torn down months later. The Brennan family didn't want it standing. But some say at night, if you walk past that tree line, you can still hear the echo of something just barely audible, like an old radio clicking on, static filling a space no longer there. And for the people who knew Walter, or thought they did, the question that will never settle is the simplest one. How close was he when they stopped looking?